Welcome, everyone, to today's panel about capacity building. Before I introduce, or let our panel introduce themselves, can I see a show of hand of anyone in the room who is actually delivering capacity building? Yeah? Okay. Just curious to know the layout. And some moderator comments before we get started. It's a discussion amongst the panel, but also with all of you. So feel free to put your hand up if you want to contribute to the conversation or ask a question, and we can have it as a pretty loose flowing session as well. So let's see how that goes. But it is an open conversation, and you're invited to join in as well. So to introduce myself, I'm Stephanie O'Donnell. I run the WildLabs program, which is a global community for conservation technology. We host conversations online, host resources and trainings and resources to support anyone using conservation technology in conservation, whether it's camera trapping, remote sensing, biologgers, acoustics, protected area management tools, all the way through to analytics and AI. So we're a resource for the conservation sector. And so I've been invited here to help host this conversation with colleagues. Tony, do you want to take away and introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Steph. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to the session. My name's Tony Lynam. I work for the Wildlife Conservation Society and the Global Conservation Technology team. And a lot of what I do is to deliver training to teams around the world, working with ranger teams, park managers, and also conservation practitioners. So pleased to be here with you.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Maurice Shutgens. I'm the Director of Conservation for Space for Giants. We are an international conservation charity looking to secure Africa's wild places and driving socioeconomic benefits to people who live alongside them. We work in a number of countries, but mainly have good programs in Kenya, Uganda, and Gabon.
Hi everyone, I'm Kev Marriott. I'm the Technical Director for the Forgotten Parks Foundation. I've been working for over a decade delivering technical capacity in primarily radio systems across multiple parks, all over Africa, from kind of Mali all the way across to kind of Somalia. I also primarily now work for XPrize, where it's kind of an innovation hub where we're incentivizing with multiple million-dollar prizes to enhance technology within the biodiversity and conservation space.
Hi everyone, I'm Alina Daati. I am the Technical Director of ConTech Africa. It's a locally Tanzanian-based consultancy that deals with capability development. So I do work with different organizations to develop their technical skills, but also work with what they have so that to improve their system functionalities.
All right, I'd like to throw the first question to Maurice and ask you, everyone talks about capacity building. It's a popular buzzword in grant applications, but to what end? Where does the responsibility of the capacity builder end?
So I think it's like question number 16 or number 17 on like a Darwin grant. How are you going to do capacity building? And I always cringe. I'm like, oh God, what am I going to say this time? And yeah, it kind of speaks to the heart of what we're trying to do, right? Because if we're not trying to impart knowledge or build capacity of the people and the stakeholders we're working with, then what are we really doing, right? But then it starts asking you other questions, to what end are we trying to do capacity building? When do you start and when do you end? And yet capacity building is not finite, right? You never stop learning, right? So what is an endpoint for something that never ends? It's a bit of a paradox. And what do you do when you go through a capacity building cycle and you haven't reached what you have determined to be your desired output? What do you do then, right? And so it's asking you a lot of difficult questions. And some of the things that I've been reflecting on a lot recently is that what is the responsibility of a capacity builder, right? So once you engage with a partner, a stakeholder, or whoever it might be, it's where does your responsibility start and where does it end? So we want to achieve a certain outcome, but how do we ensure that we achieve that outcome when the person you're working with might not have the tools, the resources, or anything required to achieve that outcome, right? So a conservation partner who is here, around here somewhere, who I was discussing an opportunity with last year at the EarthRanger conference, we were applying for this grant, and I said, this is what we want to do. Could we partner on it? And he said, Maurice, it's good and well that you want to do this, but you'd be better worth spending that money on socks and boots and rations and allowances and things like that, rather than trying to impart or impose a certain type of capacity building program on top of them, giving additional responsibilities to them that they have no way of fulfilling, right? So it asks you a lot of difficult questions, and you have to kind of reflect on it yourself to see, is this the right thing to do at the right time? And I think that that's the place where you should start when it comes to capacity building.
Do you all agree?
Well, I was going to suggest that we should think about problem-oriented capacity building. What is the problem that we're trying to address? And so I remember about 25 years ago when we first started training rangers in Thailand, it was all about building capacity to stop poaching of ungulate prey species for tigers. It was a tiger-focused training. And so we were really trying to do two things. One is build capacity for the protection, and so we did training of rangers to build their capacity and how to read maps and use GPSs. Back in those days, we had these big brick GPSs to teach the rangers to use, and it was pretty confusing for them. And then basic techniques in how to navigate and how to get around the forest, but then also how to do the monitoring and how to measure the results of the protection efforts. So we were teaching a different group of people how to set camera traps and how to record observations of tigers and tiger prey species. So it was a problem-oriented approach, and I think that's really important to think about.
Alina, does this fit in with your experience?
I tend to agree, and I think for the most part, and I'll give an example. I mean, this example is good. It's not like technical as in technical skills, but it falls within what we're talking about. And it's like organizations would hear of something and be like, we want this. But there's always that part of, are you actually able to, fulfill and meet the demand of what you want? So I'll give an example. There's a whole, this like, oh, this organization has got a canine unit, oh, we want a canine unit, but there's a whole process of like, it's not just a matter of getting a canine, it's like, it's a whole process to make sure that it is sustainable, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's the same, and I think the role of people who are doing capacity building is to shed some light on like doing a needs assessment, like, okay, so this is what you want, but you need to have A, B, C, D so that this is sustainable, et cetera, et cetera. And I also think on like, where does it end? It depends on the willingness and the buy-in from management. How much are they willing to invest to make what they're building last, and not just like be a 2-year thing and then everything just falls through the cracks.
Yeah, I think I'd just like to bring it and focus more on the technology. If the basics haven't been covered, like if your staff don't have boots, they don't have socks, and you're not quite there, you're not quite ready to develop the capacity to bring technology in there. If the guys are struggling with the just having the basic ability to do patrols and effectively manage the park just with the basics, so you have to get those right before you even go ahead to look at developing technical capacity.
And so assuming you have the basics there, how do you go about assessing the technical needs of an organisation, the capacity building needs?
So, like Alina said, you've got to do a needs assessment, and that's pretty much vital. And that's going to need site visits, discussions with all stakeholders within that protected area, to identify where the gaps are, and then potentially where you can build, to develop that capacity to fill those gaps.
We heard this morning about WCS talking about building 50 sites around the world for, it sounds like a big element of that is capacity building. Is that correct? Do you want to speak a little bit more about the approach? I guess I'm curious to hear where the shared collaboration opportunity is. Is it the responsibility of organisations to do internal capacity building, or what's the role of external partners and collaborative initiatives like SMART, like this 50 Sites?
Sure. So the idea is to have global hubs where we have training going on, building capacity, and developing technology and developing partnerships too. And so I think it's important for us to develop capacity within countries, especially within institutions, for conservation technology. And so one of the things that we're doing is to identify institutions where we can house training programs. One of the things that we did about 5 years ago was to look to the colleges in Africa where there was an opportunity to build courses and build curricula for training. And we've worked with the College of African Wildlife Management in Mweka in Tanzania and helped them to develop a curriculum for training conservation tech at different levels. And as part of that, we developed a training of trainers program, which evolved into an exercise to build the capacity of the college instructors. And now they're running their own courses, and they're actually teaching those courses to government officials. So we have Mweka now is a regional hub for conservation tech. It's emerging as a regional hub for training. Already they were doing wildlife management and tourism management training, and now it's emerging that they're teaching things like SMART and hopefully in the future EarthRanger and other tools. So I think it's really important to build that capacity and to have institutions adopt the conservation technology best practices and then codify it in their training curricula and have it accepted and accredited within their institutions.
Maurice, I see you nodding along.
No, I just couldn't agree more. No, I think you said it. I'm not going to add anything to that.
Before we go on, any questions yet from the audience that you want to throw to the group?
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, they say it goes by saying you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I'm saying this because some of the organizations we find ourselves into, based on the structures, is that you find that there's lots of old or aging staff members. Now, this with capacity building, what is your advice on how you go about it? Thank you.
I'll have a quick go. You've put that very diplomatically, so congratulations. I think you're speaking to one of where does capacity building fall apart? And you've touched on exactly one of them, right? Because you've got that resistance at a high level, and if you can't break through that, then everything collapses. And we've seen that disparity between, quite often you have leaders in their respective organizations saying, okay, go and attend a training course, that's fine. And then those trained individuals come back, and then they are not operating in an enabling environment, right? Where they are provided with the tools and the resources they need to then use the newfound skills, and then the whole system collapses, right? So while you have to work with the individuals on the lower levels and lower echelons to teach them these basic skills, at the same time, you've got to take the older guard, right, on a journey with you to understand it. And we were talking in a previous session, I think Andrew was talking about it, is you have to have simple tools to demonstrate, either it's visually or otherwise, to show them the value of something and what they can get out of it as a leadership team as well, right? So you cannot but engage with that leadership, and you have to win them on site. If you can't, then you're not going to succeed. So you have to try and get them on side. And you do that either diplomatically, like yourself, right? Or you invite people out and you show them different experiences. And anyone who has more experience?
I mean, I'd just say, or echo what you just said about, or towards the end about, showing them the actual, what they're going to get, or, the actual value of that technology or capacity, which, I think I travel and I've worked in loads of different parks. I'm not there for any real long length of time. I'm normally, I'm in there. I'm maybe there for 2 to 4 weeks, and then I'm out. But the amount I've learned from going down, from working in like all these different parks, is immense. And I think the sharing those experiences and visiting a site that is really benefiting from that technology, can help to sell it and kind of win those people over, because a large part of that capacity building is the organisation taking ownership of it. That's one of the things that we've got to be able to push. So once the technology is being developed or implemented, it has to be the people that are receiving it have to completely kind of adopt it and take ownership of it, and then devolve the responsibility down, for all the chains, all the way down to the end users.
Now, just to add on what has already been said, I think also as capacity builders, you need to be very frank. When you see something, you have to say it as it is. Of course, you have to be diplomatic, but you have to say the truth. Like, this is where you are, this is what you will need. And if you don't do this, this is what's going to happen. This is what you'll be losing. This is what you gain. So that sort of like having a very frank conversation, of course, diplomatically, so that you ensure that your point is, you make your point very clearly. But again, I think back to like how invested the organization is, depending on how invested they are, then they will either take that or not. But I think as a capacity builder, you would have done like the best to your ability at that point.
What I'm hearing come through from all of your comments is that capacity building is not training in a piece of technology. It's all of the things around it as well. What would you say is covered under? What is capacity building?
Well, I'll take cover that. So for me, it's just the ability to, learn, absorb, and apply the knowledge, but also having the environment to try or do what you have learned, so that enabling environment. Like I think Maurice mentioned here, you take people to like a training and whatever, and then come back to their work environment, and there's all these restrictions, and so that never actually progresses. So I think it's an entire ecosystem of, like from in a conservation perspective, like the rangers collecting the right data, using their radios correctly, the data being collected and collated centrally, being right, and then that like it's both bottom up and top bottom. So it's an entire ecosystem that it needs to function correctly, because if at one point there is any weakness, then that's where it should start to happen.
Okay, I'm going to pass it over to an audience member.
I think you raised a really important point there about that whole ecosystem and the enabling environment. And I was just wondering if anyone has heard of the acronym TEPID oil.
I have, yeah.
Yeah, because I think that's quite a helpful one, to break down what that enabling environment is and that whole ecosystem of things that when you're bringing a new capability into an organization to make sure it sticks. So TEPID oil is just, T for training, what training needs to be given, E, the equipment that's needed to make the capability work, P is the personnel, the specific roles and duties that are needed, I, information, D, the doctrine, the procedures, the workflows, O is the organization, how it's going to be managed, I, the second I then is infrastructure, where it's going to be located, stored, L, logistics, and F, the finance. So particularly like the long-term financing of that whole thing. Because I think, when with some of the tech, like the drones and the cameras, camera traps, that's where you can see like those missing pieces in the TEPID oil F system, and then it just fails immediately as soon as it's brought in. So even if the training is given in how to use the thing, the rest of it isn't there.
Just to add that I think building capacity has to produce conservation outcomes that are tangible. So if we're seeing change, we're seeing increases in tigers, we're seeing increases in our wildlife, we're seeing increases in human capacity at the same time as these results, then we're heading in the right direction. So I like to think about using approaches that build capacity to make change, and trying to get managers on board with making change. Because if we're not making change, we're staying the same. We're not going to be addressing all these crises that we have.
Okay, one request. I'm going to keep passing it to audience. Before you ask your question, can you introduce yourself so we can know who you are and where you're from?
Thank you. Amour from WCS Congo. And just sharing a few experience about to be diplomatics, for example. In the Congo context, it depends sometimes to the world chosen or the center chosen to talk about capacity building. The government recruit many new judges and they send them to the local courts. When they come, they don't have experience about wildlife law, for example. And we need to give them some training about this law, to explain it. And when we chose the sentences, capacity building, they just say, how you can build a house. We had a specialist about law, and you had just an organization, you can build that to explain the law or to understand the law. And we just keep and just change the word, capacity building on support or sensitization, and they come. Now they are the big specialists in this law, and so sometimes to be diplomatic here can be a very good thing.
Yeah, just to respond to that, one of the things that we've done with the SMART partnership is to change the discussion from capacity building to talking about competency. How can we become competent in using SMART tools? And how do you define the competency? And who should be competent? And at what levels? So we've actually built a competence register that defines the things you need to know to be able to use SMART to make change. And it's very systematic, and it's a detailed approach. And you can translate that into any language and make it understood. I think that's important to make that distinguishing feature.
Does certification have a role here as well? Like accreditation and that sort of approach fitting into competencies and the model of how you're training and assessing as well?
It can do. Like I mentioned before, accreditation is essentially getting acceptance from an institution or a government for a particular type of training. So it's good to have, but it's not necessary to have accreditation, at least in the initial stages of building competency. You want to define what it is that people need to know and get them to that point where they know what the competencies. But then beyond that, getting acceptance for conservation tech requires that organizations decide that we want to have it. We want to have it in our training program, and they have a formal curriculum, and they include conservation tech in the way they do their training. And then once it's institutionalized, then you have accreditation, and then things can run by themselves. So that can lead to sustainability.
Okay.
Yeah, my name is Samuel Eposo. I'm from Masai Mara National Reserve, Kenya. And I was to ask about competency, and especially if there are, for example, some protected area assessment, capacity assessment studies that are available for maybe, I know there is, of course, distinct condition or issues within different protected areas that need maybe different capacity assessment study. But when you talk about capacity, I'm looking into the ecosystem, as she says, especially in terms of you need to capacity build by providing the technical, for example, the skills that's required. You also capacity build by providing the required equipments and all that. But the most important thing that we forget, and I think even if you have all these equipments and materials and resources, We were taken through a keynote speech yesterday by Nedi, and if you don't really capacity build these rangers by providing, and we know the struggle each protected area or conservancy house in terms of remunerations, in terms of the well-being of these rangers, and we have seen, because in where I come from, we can see those people, those rangers who are really, anytime you go to the field and you have something like allowances and all that, vis-a-vis those who don't have, they really struggle, and you see those who are highly motivated because of the extra thing they get, results are seen as what you want to see at the end. What is the results in terms of conservation, and that's what I wanted to ask.
I'm not sure I'm getting the question there. Sorry.
Do you want
to just summarize it?
Let me summarize it in this way, because it seems very clear in terms of the training. It's very clear that's one of the capacity building that is we required. The equipment is another thing, and I know, of course, you cannot capacity build by training without giving them the materials they need. But there's one critical thing. Yesterday, Nedi took us through the ratio that is not available, the small remuneration, especially the welfare. Yeah. Welfare, that is the biggest thing.
Yeah, I don't do ranger welfare.
No, because I think we touched on that. I think Kev or
I agree.
Maurice, touched on that. Like, you get the basics right, like the basic, and then you build on that. So I think that was touched, but it was in terms of like boots and socks and et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, it's the welfare to, you create an environment that motivates these people to work. Yeah.
John.
Oh, okay.
John Cox, WCS. How are you guys creating KPIs that can reliably measure the capacity that you set yourselves to build? Because because there can only ever be a proxy, right? And sometimes people use quite odd ones to measure something. So how are you actually making sure, once you've defined it, the capability that you're trying to build, and take it right the way through? I mean, how are you measuring that?
So for me, I've been developing technical capacity, in terms of radio systems, mainly in parks. So one of those KPIs for me is I'm a service provider in there delivering the radio systems, but handing over that knowledge and delivering training so that people on the ground can actually be completely self-sufficient is one of those key performance indicators. And if they are able to do that after the training, and be able to be self-sufficient and not rely on outside assistance from contractors and consultants to come in and fix some things that could be really, really trivial, then it's kind of achieved its aim. So for me and what I deliver in terms of capacity building for technologies, that if I deliver a technology, I deliver training. I want the guys to be able to be self-sufficient on it, completely self-sustained, and if they're able to achieve that, then they've kind of met that.
No. My question is going to be, can you give an example of an odd KPI?
Oh, an odd one. Okay, sure. So what I've seen in a national park would be measuring the success of a law enforcement strategy. And somebody said, it's the lack of mining in an area. Now, what we had was a really big super mine, which was drawing all the miners into that. So actually, the numbers of mines was going down, but actually the amount of mining was staying the same. So actually, the law enforcement strategy wasn't necessarily being successful, if you understand that example. And so I guess, if I just drill into it, Kevin, sorry to press you a bit, on this, but I'm just interested in how you do it. But in terms of, so when you talk about people being self-sufficient, what's the actual measurand that you're using to define whether they're self-sufficient?
Well, so it'll be the complete cutaway from reliance on outside assistance. It would obviously start with a little bit of mentoring, so some remote assistance, but then you're in the context that I work in, not being able to, like I said, the guys being completely self-sufficient, completely on their own, unreliant on outside assistance. And Alina is kind of one of those proof of concepts for me. She attended one of my training courses maybe 4 years ago, and it was prior to COVID, and COVID was a real huge test in that self-sufficiency, and everything was shut down, as we all know. People weren't be able to get in, and even within the same country. So those guys that had attended some of the training course and invested in people and invested in developing that technical capacity, not just the equipment, but the investment in people and training people, was kind of proven within those that had received it and had that foresight. And no one saw COVID coming, but it was a huge kind of test for those parks, and it kind of won through, and that's the way that we need to go, is that investment in people, deliver the capacity in full, whether it's train the trainer, like Tony mentioned, or just training and really investing in the development of the technical skills of those people that are going to take ownership of the technology that's in.
One of the things that is a measure of whether competency has been achieved is, can you teach somebody else to do that task? So one of the things that I'm focusing on in training people how to use smart tools is building capacity for training and focusing on training at different levels. So we have smart tools for rangers, for people collecting data. We have a training for analysts and administrators, people who use the smart software to do analyses of data and create reports. And we have trainings for managers to get them to understand how they can use the information products from smart to make decisions and make change. And so kind of the ultimate thing that we're trying to get to is building capacity for people to actually teach others to do that within their systems, within their parks, within their colleges. So a lot of what I do these days is training trainers and designing curricula for training trainers, with the view to building not just the capacity to actually use the tools, but actually to teach other people and to basically work me out of a job. So eventually I won't be necessary to go to that place. And slowly that's working. So in places like Mongolia, in Cambodia, and in Tanzania, building the capacity on the ground to do this training.
Yeah, just to add on that, it's a good question. How do you measure the impact of your capacity building? I think Andrew again said in the last session, he said there's a difference between effort and impact, right? And again, it speaks to then what is the problem that you're trying to address, firstly, and then you set your KPIs around that particular problem, obviously. And Clarine's here, my colleague, who does all of our capacity building training, and going in there and doing self-assessment scores of the people you're training as well. I think that's a really important measure about confidence. How confident do people perceive themselves to be in a certain thing, and measuring that periodically over time. I think that's very useful. But then the proof is in the pudding, right? So what we do a lot of is tasking. When we've trained people on a certain thing, and then at some point we will ask, can you do such and such a task, and see if they can apply what was learned to that. And then you immediately know whether something has got uptake, or you have to go back and retrain, right? It all comes to the whole mentorship element now, where if you're not in it for the long term, then maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place, right? Because if you can only assign a small amount of time, then it will collapse without a support network. Yeah.
Did you want one last comment?
No, so I think
I'll come back to you.
Thanks. Andrew Lemieux, lead conservation, and we've got a pretty good example of how we're trying to do this with our lead ranger program. So one of the things we're training in is Coach Ranger Lifesaver, right? Teaching people how to provide first aid after trauma, but more importantly, developing an instructor. So the ways that we're measuring the capacity building is both pre and post-course assessments, right? Before the course, what did they know about these techniques? After the course, what did they do? We test competencies, we measure those at the training, but more importantly is what happens afterwards, right? Because our goal is that these individuals go back to their organization and they run trainings on their own. So one KPI is like, do they run the trainings? But the ultimate KPI for us is when we get those terrible, stories in the sense of, somebody was fishing, they got bit by a crocodile. One of the people that we trained responded, got the tourniquet on, evacuated them to the clinic, and that for us that's our impact. Now that's our true KPI is number of interventions after a traumatic injury attended by one of our trainees or someone they trained, because we also see that where our trainers have people we've trained go back in. So one of our KPIs is actually like lives saved or at least interventions. But again, that's this difference of time frame, right? Because you can do pre and post course assessment, that's all great. But for us, and luckily it's rare, these are rare events, but it's when we get that picture of somebody saying, look, we got this person to the hospital. That's really important for us. And that's an example for a first aid training. Ultimately, what we would like to do is have people go into these protected areas and run audits on our people, but the cost associated with sending somebody back in to run an audit on the competencies is a bit high. But that for me would be sort of going towards your question, John, about these KPIs and how to measure them, true capacity measures. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Wendy from Swallow Kalahari Reserve up in the Northern Cape province of South Africa. I'm just kind of coming onto the scene in the ecological world and looking at how these systems work. And I seem to have fallen into a system where we've got guys that have worked on the property the entire time it has existed. And so there's never historically been a need for a succession plan, which I think is insane. So we don't have that succession plan. These guys are coming to retirement and there's no succession plan. So my question is, as a young person coming into the system, how do I use this framework of capacity building to motivate for that succession plan? If you can give me like top tips or kind of the go for the jugular best points to go into this, that would be appreciated.
Do you mean in terms of the like expat staff staying on, or how do you mean?
Yeah, so in other words, I want to go back and I want to be able to say this is why we need a succession plan, but I want to be able to use capacity building as a motivator. But I want to know what the strongest points would be to put forward to motivate for that.
I mean, the way I looked at it was, it's a huge continent, and everybody should be looking at being able to hand over, the park or the reserve after developing that capacity, and have it self-sustainable, and run internally within its own wildlife authority, and because everybody's looking at doing that, if you're not on board and you're just trying to hold on to things, you eventually you're gonna just kind of get left behind, and like I said, it's a huge continent. We're supposed to be increasing protected areas, so the work shouldn't dry up, and I think if you get a good reputation and are seen to be on board with wanting to achieve that, to be able to hand over responsibility completely, then that should only benefit you and be a big kind of, if you get to a point where you've taken the park all the way through to being self-sufficient, in everything, then you've achieved something that many parks haven't. And if you've done that, then that's going to be a big kind of tick in the box for like a CV, and being able to move that and take that those lessons learned and apply it in another protected area would be hugely beneficial to anybody that's looking to be able to bring on any new members of staff that are on board with that.
Okay. So I will just start by saying I think capacity building takes a lot of money, time, and effort. And what organizations should strive to do is actually sustain that knowledge within the organization, even after the people who they had invested that time, effort, and money into have left.
How do you do that?
Well, again, I mean, there is no like a magic bullet or anything. So like, I'm not gonna give but I'm just gonna give an example for myself. Having worked with an organization that invested so much in me, and I took it upon myself to develop my team, and I've left the organization, but I know I've left it in some very good hands. I actually had to promote some of my team members to take on the role that I had, and they're doing pretty well. So what I'm doing now is just mentoring them to be completely self-sufficient. It's just like what Tony said. I need to be out of a job in a good way. You know, I need to do my job so good that they don't need me anymore. And I think if you go with the you know, like coming from an angle of, there is a lot that is put into capacity building in terms of money, time, and effort. It's almost like, I don't know, I'll be surprised if no one would want to take that and make sure that that knowledge will be still maintained and sustained within an organization after a person has moved on. So it's almost like a motivation to have some sort of a succession plan, because you don't want to be doing that. Imagine if you've got a high turnover. I mean, I don't know who can sustain investing so much on different people, let's say yearly. So, yeah.
Yeah, hi, Wendy. It's a very good question, and it sets the hairs up on my neck, because it's something that, you know, Space for Giants has been guilty of. We've had a lot of institutional knowledge vested in a single resource, right? And people are everything. They're your most important assets. And when that individual left our organization, we dropped our entire program. Our relationships got broken, all the uptake we had amongst all of our stakeholders, the interest was gone immediately, and we had to start from scratch, essentially, again, but then 4 or 5 months later, and all the previous money was invested was gone, right? So, I mean, I think you got to keep this simple, and if what you're running now is a successful operation that everyone can see, oh, this is fantastic, right? I mean, your leadership has to be awake and alive to the fact that that situation can't hold, right? And that they must invest in putting resources on the ground to shadow those people, to be mentored, because a worst case scenario is that you literally lose, 10 years of success overnight. You can. It's just not worth it.
Wait a second.
Yeah, hi, sorry, just Kieran Avery from Northern Kenya, working with Native. Having been through something quite similar recently in a big organization there. The big issue there was this founder syndrome. And I don't know if you're talking about managerial level or junior staff level, but the one thing that we found there, the only real way to sort of address it, because the founder syndrome was so significant, was to bring in an external entity, like a change entity, who came in. And we used Boston Consultancy Group, and they came in and basically did a whole strategy plan, looked at the whole staffing structure, sat down with the senior management staff and said, this is the way forward. So it's just an idea for you to think about.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that on a staffing plan. Having a good career progression as well, and a lot of conservation organisations at the park level, they're very kind of flat. There's a couple of jobs that are in there that are like in charge of the logistics, in charge of like the radio systems or something like that. But there's very little in the way of like career progression that can be seen. And that also comes into tying in with retention as well. Once you develop capacity and provide training to people, how do you retain them? And having a clear kind of career progression path it can also help with that. And also assist with devolving that responsibility and sharing some of the information as well, and having somebody that can step up when needs be, when the other person is not in the park temporarily, and moving from a flat structure to more of a kind of clear path of career progression at all kinds of different levels.
Yeah, just to add to what Kev said, having set up a country program for my organisation, it was important to create leadership pathways for recruiting young conservationists, some who were coming straight out of university, and give them roles where they can see where they can go, rather than just giving them a TOR and telling them this is your job for the next 3 months, 6 months. Show them that this is what's possible, that they can become a research assistant and an associate researcher, and then they can be charged of the wildlife monitoring team, and creating those kinds of pathways and making it very explicit when people come in that there are opportunities for them to move ahead. Then you retain good people, and then those people feel more valued, and then at the end they're sharing their knowledge, and they feel that they're valued enough that people want their knowledge. And so if they leave the organisation, they leave having shared that knowledge. And it's fine if you train people You spend 10 years investing in somebody in your program, eventually they jump to another organization. At least you've gotten a good conservationist out there, and they're in the community and they're doing good work. So leadership pathways is really important.
I really liked, we had a conversation yesterday before this panel, and the term circular economy within conservation came up as a way to describe what you guys are talking about. Kev, do you want to talk to that?
You know, like if you're, Tony brought up a good point. You know, if somebody leaves an organisation, if they're still within the conservation space, you know, it's not really a loss. You know, it is for the organisation, but not necessarily conservation as a whole. But you know, if we're training people in, you know, technology that is also or used more on the outside of conservation than it is inside. You know, like the radio systems, for instance. You know, how do you retain that? How do you keep a young guy potentially who's, you know, been trained in radio system? He's now got a certificate from Motorola to say that he's, you know, like trained in that particular radio system. You know, how do you stop him from then moving to the city and you know, taking a job that's potentially paying more? And one of the things that one of the strategies that we're trying to put together with the radio systems is this idea of like a circular economy. So, you know, people that have invested in that capability of having technically trained staff and sufficient tools and everything to actually do the job as maintenance, to then kind of share that position with other adjacent parks that maybe haven't developed that capability yet. So that then, you know, in a similar way where, you know, air assets might be shared between certain organisations when there's, I don't know, like rhino ops going on or something like that. You know, we should be open to be able to share those technical capabilities with others as well. And you know, if that comes at a smaller cost, then, you know, that's just a reinvestment of that funding. And you know, that can help to either top up that person's salary to make it more competitive, or you know, just invest in you know, other building up that capability even further, so that, you know, you've then got more members of staff and you don't suffer as much from when one person leaves.
Okay, another question.
Thank you. Antoine Marshall from Rainforest Trust, based out of Angola. I've seen organizations, speaking about the performance of capacity building, I've seen organizations that are actually afraid to invest in capacity building, because the first thing that happens when you send someone for training is that they come back and they ask twice the salary. Or they get poached by mining companies that offer twice the salary, and you can't really compete with them. Are there any direct mechanism that can be put in place to avoid that? For example, turning the training into a loan, and if the person leaves too soon after, they have to reimburse the training?
I mean, I think you could try and get them to sign on for a certain length of time, and yeah, that might be a bit difficult. You know, like I said, I like the idea of being able to share those trained capacities between, you know, if somebody's received technical training, you know, keep it in the family and just have that circular economy, you know, because he or she would benefit if they go out to another protected area. You know, they're going to learn a lot just from working on another park or area, delivering that same capacity, you know, there. So by the time they come back, they're always going to improve. They're going to be better. They're going to learn more. They're going to see things that have gone wrong and had to overcome them. So I think there's a great benefit in sharing the capacity once it's built within one particular reserve or organisation, you know, with others. And I think if we're open to that, you know, we can keep that circular economy going, and you just kind of multiplying that donor funds rather than it going out to a consultant and then, you know, that's it. It's like we receive a donor funds, and then we pay a consultant to come, and then that's it. If we rather than pay a consultant, we can use capability that's been developed by another organisation, then, you know, that organisation then benefits from that funding as well. So you know, that idea of circular economy is definitely, you know, my opinion, the way to go. Tony, do you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the culture of the organisation is really important, and if people get trained and they come back and they're in a culture, an organisational culture that is really encouraging them to perform in their role, it helps them to stay where they are. But it's also good for people to go out and experience another culture, and to go out and to join another organisation. And I like to promote that. If somebody wants to leave WCS and go to work for FFI, great. If they're going to the next level of their career and they can have more impact in conservation, that's fantastic. And one example is a young man I trained many, many years ago in Indonesia. And late 90s, wow, a long time ago, we hadn't had camera traps in Indonesia. We brought camera traps. We trained a team to do the first tiger surveys. And we had this one young fellow was just really great with surveys and became the lead tiger expert for our organization. Well, eventually he decided he wanted to leave, and we kind of encouraged him because he went to the next level in another organization, in FFI, and eventually he became the chair of this organization called Harimau Kita, which is the Indonesian tiger conservation organization, which brought together all of the people doing tiger conservation, and he was the chair. So it was great to see him progress from, being essentially a wildlife surveyor for WCS to being project leader for FFI and eventually becoming the chair of this national kind of group.
Just to interrupt,
Yeah.
but I think what the question was is not movement within our sector, it's leakage out of the sector. Is there anything we can do, or is that just inevitable?
One of the other strategies that was discussed as well is, like, why are people leaving? Sometimes it's not always for money. It's also, they're living in a remote area. Some of the staff spend a long time without being with their families. So, somebody that's got a high level of training and a high level of investment, look at that, career progression, and perhaps giving that person more, liberties to be able to have like family close by, housing close by, or something like that. I mean, obviously there's a lot of logistics that goes into that, schooling, access to education, and everything else. But there's other ways to kind of retain some of these technical staff, and maybe that comes into that, career progression and positions of leadership, locally within the reserves that can be afforded to them, a little bit more, amenities and benefits.
Maurice, Alina, anything to add? You don't have to. We can move on.
Let's move on.
Okay. All right.
Oh, this is actually also to that topic, because I feel you, and we had the same issues. Sorry, I'm Kristen from Elephant Human Relations Aid in Namibia. So yeah, we also heavily invested in our teams, and had sponsored driver's licenses and other type of training. And then the people never returned and just immediately got a job somewhere else. And that's really hard, especially for a small NGO and like tight on funding and so on. So we learned the hard way. And I don't know if we found the right way 100%, but what does help a lot is from the beginning and maybe throughout the employment is to really have a very good conversation with every single staff member and do one-to-ones and also understand their specific goals in life, in their career, because in the very beginning, sometimes, you ask, where do you want to go? What's important for you? And what's your goal? And then suddenly their eyes lit up and it's like, oh, I really love to travel and I want to be a tour guide. And I'm like, okay, but that's really great. But I think then that's probably not what you get within our organization. So probably understanding that in the beginning might help you avoid losing people along the way.
Can I just add to that? I think you're right, Kristen. I want to say something else. Alina, you're an example, right, where you got all this capacity and then you've moved on, but you felt a responsibility and a willingness to train up the people amongst you. So I think it's about those honest conversations. I don't believe in jobs for life, right? If in 5 years' time you want to be somewhere else, you're using this job as a stepping stone, that's fantastic. But it's about the organizational culture where you build it, that there is a yeah, there is a responsibility for the organization and seeing it succeed in future after they're gone, right? And when they start feeling that, indicating that, you know, maybe I am getting to a point and I want to start actively mentoring people and building a solid foundation, because, you know, I think we all hate recruitment, you know, and doing recruitment sucks and it takes a long time. And, you know, so I think you try and instill a little part of those values in your individuals that work in your organization.
It's also when you get blindsided, when you've invested and you're like, okay, I thought we were in this together. Oh, you're going? Okay. And so I think the conversation you're talking about having quite early is really important. So you're with us, and I know where you're going, and yes, our journeys are aligned for a certain amount, and then you're going to go off and we're going to be a springboard for you. And at the same time, as a manager, as a program director, you're planning the resources so that when they leave, it's not like, oh my God, everything's gone. It's the pathway that you have to give them a runway and yourself a pathway through as well. Okay, throwing to another community member. Audience member, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Simon from Zimbabwe. What I have seen some institutions doing to try and address such scenarios is to use what they call a bonding system. We send you to a college or a training, you acquire whatever skills, you come back, we get into a contract. You work for us for 2 years before you make any other decisions of leaving us. If you do go, a certain percentage out of your terminal benefits will be forfeited to the institution. If you decide to go after the 2 years bonding period, that's fine. Goodbye. Thank you.
Well, that's quite straightforward, so thank you for that. So, I mean, I have nothing against people wanting to move on, because that means they're growing. Growth is good. But also them moving on gives the opportunity to the people below them to grow. So, but I do agree with Kristen, having these conversations, because with my team members, when I used to work for the organization a few years ago, it's like I always had these conversations like, what do you want to do? Like, find a cause that is, of course, not going to take you away from your role for like a year or two, but like an online cause that you're interested in, you know? And then let's see how we can help you build you to a certain level, or like take you where you want to be. And I have had team members who were working in an ops room, but they wanted to be tour guides. And knowing that enabled myself and my former boss to, you know, find ways to take him through that path. So there's nothing wrong with that, but I think it's mainly the culture, the environment. Do you actually have these honest conversations? Because I know most times when somebody leaves that you have invested so much, you almost feel betrayed. But I think we should almost try to remove ourselves from that and try to understand that they need to grow, you know. And I think for somebody to leave a role for a better position, that should actually look very good on you as a leader. So.
I think if I could just reply to that, Alina. So I think most people don't leave because they want to grow. In my experience, I think most people leave a job because they're unhappy. When I look back at the people I've known who've left positions in the 4 careers I've had so far, and I think, what you're actually talking about there is right. You're talking about good management, and Kristen's talking about good management here, but we haven't actually said that yet. And one thing I'd observe and perhaps recommend, if I may be so bold, is investing in managers so they can manage people better, so that people stay happy and don't leave. I think is an effective tool as well, and I do think it's often overlooked in conservation.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that there's ways that you can encourage people to think about their professional goals within the context of what they're doing in your organization, and by having a plan, a work plan for an annual plan, like a performance evaluation, where you set the goals that you want to have for what you want to do in your role, and you set the goals for your professional development, and that's shared with your manager, and the manager and you agree on what those will be, and then those professional development goals can be a part of what you do in your job. So that it could be training, it could be learning something new, it could be traveling to a project that you hadn't been to. But we have that, and it actually works really well within our organization. So that's something you can do, and I think that helps managers also to organize their staff.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Is there a burning commentary or final question you want to throw to the audience, throw to the panel? All right. What is my final question then? What do you think the big missing thing is from capacity building right now? If you could fix one thing or change one thing about what we're doing, what would it be for each of you? Offloaded.
Well, like I said, I think that circular economy is the key, and pushing that out, and as well as like we said, positions of leadership and management. Within there, getting a good career progression path, and that circular economy can help, and potentially the capacity building shouldn't cost us anything, because we're saving on bringing people from outside and consultancy fees and things like that. So if we can do it internally and share with those that haven't got there yet, and still do it at a much more price or cost effective way of doing it within a circular economy, rather than having to bring in people from outside, I think it would help.
Mine would be that, we, in the conservation sector, we quite often say, we don't have the skill sets available to us. And I think there's obviously, there's training curricula and an overarching body that would do all of this training and capacity building. But what I think is important is if there were some way that we could consistently, as a whole conservation community, be offering internships for people to build their capacity and have those experiences, if at all possible, financed, because it takes a lot of time and effort to take on an intern. You invest in that, but yet those experiences are going to be so valuable to those individuals who are going to go to other places. And if we could find some way to get that institutionalized amongst all of us, that we all consistently take on interns to teach them specific skill sets, I think that'd be quite valuable.
Before you speak, Tony, we've got an extra panel member who wanted to jump in.
Sorry, it's not a question, it's a comment, just on top of yours. I think most of the talk was around individual capacity building. But something that's going to be actually very key for the future that we didn't really speak too much about is institutional capacity building. I think we're going to have more and more local NGOs that will be the main actors in the future. And I think that's what's really, really key.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I think an institution needs to have a vision for how it's going to develop and how it's going to build its capacity. And so having a strategy for that, that is maybe a vision for 5 years, how we're going to develop as an organization, what's the capacity going to be at the end of that 5 years is important.
Thank you for letting me gather my thoughts. So I think with me is, and over these last few days, there has been talks about tech hubs. What else? Like
training
centers of excellence. There's so many of those that, and with African Parks, there's like another one of those. And I have been in so many conversations that speak of these institutions, but one thing I've not heard yet is how we're going to make them cohesive. So I think that is, and to your comment on like building institutional capacity, that is where I think we need to have a very honest conversation on how do we bring all these tech hubs, et cetera, that seem to be people seem to be discussing a lot. How do we actually bring them together so that we deliver something meaningful?
And when you say cohesive, are you talking more how do we align on what we're teaching so it's similar across all, or how do we build networks of collaboration? And what can you speak more about that?
Yeah, it's a combination of like what Maurice said. So how do you almost like cross-pollination, you know? Yeah. How do you just share that knowledge within the network? How do you allow outsiders to come in to learn what you're doing? So it's in that manner, and I know there's probably going to be a bit of competition, et cetera, but also aligning, because if you're teaching about smart, there are, I don't know, like how many ways are there to teach about smart? There's probably very like particular ways to do it.
And not only if you're teaching about smart, you're probably teaching about camera traps and blah.
So there are like very defined ways to teach about, you know, tech skills. Very defined. They can't be that different.
Yeah.
But it's more about cross-pollination. How do you bring people from outside to come in to understand what is happening in the conservation space, et cetera, et cetera. So
I would argue, not to blow our own horn, but I would argue that collaborations and network structures like WildLabs have a huge role to play in helping overcome silos and helping collaboration happen and build those webs in between all of these distinct efforts, and making sure we're pulling in the same direction as well, and creating a place where people can come into and share knowledge. Okay, thank you everyone. Will you join me in thanking our panel? And a really big thank you for your participation and the conversation. Feel free to come up and grab people as well.